What's up, folks? Coach Bach here with 2X Athlete. We're going to talk about fascia. So fascia is a topic that's come up on some podcasts I've done. I've done some posts on it. Just wanted to talk through it here a little bit, have kind of a resource to send to people because I do get questions about this. So fascia is connective tissue that runs all throughout your body. It surrounds your muscles. It's like in the middle of muscles. It connects everything. It's basically continuous tissue all throughout your body, right? And our knowledge of fascia comes largely from dissecting human bodies, right? You cut them open and you see this tissue there. And so, you can have that knowledge, and a lot of people have that knowledge now, like awareness of fascia exists. The big question is like what to do about it, right? There's been a lot of attempts to sort of grab onto fascia and turn it into like a whole training system or a whole brand based on fascial development or something like that. These have largely been, kind of just marketing based attempts at, creating secrecy or whatever about this mysterious tissue that's the secret of athleticism or whatever. And then there's been some more realistic takes on it, okay? And credit to those people who have more of the realistic versus the sort of marketing culty type of approach to fascia. But so I want to talk about like what's a realistic response to what we know about fascia, right? So along with kind of the basic anatomy, other things are it is innervated, okay? That there are sensory neurons that go to the fascia, okay? And that, shouldn't surprise you. You pretty much have sensory neurons going everywhere in your body, okay? And then it's also viscoelastic, which means basically like the faster you load it, the more it's going to stiffen, or it's going to like resist lengthening, okay? Whereas if it's lengthening slowly, it'll have less resistance, okay? Yeah, it's like stress strain curves. It's kind of like physics, biomechanics stuff. You don't really have to get into it, but basically the faster you load it, the more resistance it's going to have, the more tension it's going to produce.
Which causes them to slightly repel against each other. So as long as you move slowly, the grains will repel and slide past each other like a fluid. But if you do anything too fast, you'll overcome that repulsion, the particles will touch, there will be friction, and it will act as a solid.
Where do you go with that information, right? I think the base response should just be acknowledging the complexity of the soft tissue in the human body, right? And this is something that really even just musculature should teach you this. So for example, a lot of people think, all right, we do bicep curls to train, like the strength of the biceps muscles, right? But if you actually look at muscular anatomy, you're going to find out there's other elbow flexors. You got the brachialis and the brachioradialis, right? And then you might think about like your forearm flexors also working in a bicep curl, but then you have forearm extensors, right? And there's a whole bunch of them. And so you start thinking about all these different muscles in this area, and then you start thinking, okay, well, maybe I need a variety in my arm curling exercises, right? Maybe I need to do some of this. Maybe I need to do some of this and some of this. And then by the way, the biceps brachii cross the shoulder joint. And so when I have to think about shoulder position to lengthen the biceps brachii out. And so you end up thinking like, oh, I need quite a bit of variety just in my arm flexing exercises to really train all this musculature, right? And so just the musculature teaches us that lesson. You add fascia into it, and it's just another layer of complexity, and that calls for, again, like another layer of variety, where you're thinking not just about what is the muscular anatomy, but what is the fascial anatomy, and what are all the structures that I really need to address, okay? And this is the type of thing that, of course, like young athletes, not as important for, right? Because they're just more resilient. Their tissues are generally in good health, unless they're doing something kind of wacky. And so they maybe don't need to think about, doing all the angles of the legs during RDLs or during hamstring curls to hit all the hamstring muscles or something. Like most of the time, that's not really going to make any meaningful difference for them. Definitely more relevant as you get people up to high levels of athleticism, in their 20s and beyond, where staying healthy starts to get a little bit harder, where you want to think a little bit more thoroughly in terms of how you're training your soft tissue. Okay, so I think the first rational response to fascia is just, okay, there's complexity, and so then we need variety. And I would make the point that You want variety in your strength training, but also in your athletic movements, right? Your explosive, your dynamic, your elastic stuff. Especially if you're thinking about fascia, you want to think about, okay, how are we loading this? Not just, what tissues are we loading, but in what manner are we loading it, right? So diversity in your athletic movements, diversity in your strength training. That's a rational response to fascia. Another one would be connectedness in your movement, right? So fascia creates this connectedness in your tissue. And so then you want to have movements which are connected. So you're sort of training this function of the fascia where it's transmitting force from one area to another, okay? And so that's doesn't mean you have to exclusively train in a connected manner, but you probably should include that, all right? And again, there's nothing revolutionary or mind-blowing about that in terms of what the exercise selection is going to be, right? It's going to be, oh, so we should run, we should throw, we should jump, we should do, like full body strength exercises. All right, cool. Got that checked, right? Again, for healthy athletes, this is probably not a revolutionary change that you're going to make in your training. You're just be like, oh yeah, so when I sprint, I'm training my fascia as well as my muscles, right? All right, awesome. Okay, so that's another rational response. Then stiffness, right? We talk about leg stiffness, particularly in track and field, like for max velocity and for things like long jump, triple jump, things where we have to get off the ground really fast. And so particularly at the ankle joint, I think fascia probably plays a role there. And I think there's maybe a reason why a lot of naturally fast top speed athletes have limited ankle mobility, right? It might be that particularly the fascia surrounding the ankle joint is tighter, and that might be that might play a role in the talent that they have in getting off the ground fast. Okay, so when it comes to training the ankle and ankle stiffness, again, when you are doing things that hopefully you're doing, even if you've never heard of fascia, things like plyometrics where you're getting fast off the ground, things like getting running volume, right? There's probably an element to that of developing fascia. All right. Again, that doesn't really change your training. It's just like, oh yeah, that's another part of the body that I'm training. Okay. And then also, think like the IT band, not necessarily like purely fascia. It's sort of a tendon, it's kind of a weird structure. But it's definitely connective tissue, and that might play a role when it comes to like knee and hip stiffness, right? And so again, you're probably not changing your training, but you're just acknowledging, oh yeah, I'm not just working on my quad muscles when I do, bounds, for example. It's not just my quad and calf muscles, it's also the fascial system that I'm training. All right. So those are some rational responses. Again, for healthy athletes, probably there's not like a lot of changes that you do in response to that. I do think, it is valid when you get into rehab situations where people can't just like go run or go jump or whatever. And then you say, okay, but what kind of connected full body movements can we do? And that's where, there's some validity to like, maybe we're doing med ball throws. Maybe we are doing like rotational things on cables, and we're giving these people a full body exercise that they can do in this connected manner that is not explosive and violent on the body, right? So I think there is some validity to that. What I don't think is valid is just making these drastic claims about, oh, this athlete's good, it's because his fascia is elite, right? Or like the term like a fascial driven athlete, like that's not based on anything other than just kind of instinct, right? We don't know when we have a naturally fast athlete, we're not testing their fascia. We don't have experiments where like, people say they do plyometrics or they do a sprint training program and they get faster or they get more athletic in some way. And then we test something like we see, oh, and it's because their fascia got thicker or, something. Like we just don't have those types of measurements, those types of experiments on fascia to be able to make those claims about like they became more fascial driven or they became less muscularly driven or whatever, right? We just don't have the scientific data to support that stuff. It's really just conjecture. All right. So some of those claims could be accurate, but we don't know that. And so if you have somebody just building this whole brand off of, claims they're making about fascial function, it's just like, yeah, I mean, you just don't know that though, really. So yeah, those are some thoughts on fascia. Probably isn't going to revolutionize your training. There are some reasonable implications, some reasonable conclusions to draw from acknowledging fascia and acknowledging its anatomy and function. But yeah, you probably don't need to drastically change your training based off of this information. Okay, so that's my take on fascia. That spider is so large. Goodness. Like having a face-to-face conversation with this guy. Ooh, okay. Texas.